All right. Thanks for having me. I know there's some familiar names and faces on the list, and thank them for joining in as well. Hopefully people can get something out of today, and it's always about promoting an idea, but also pushing my agenda and laying down some demands, really. So see how we go. Indigenous Research Methodologies in Science. So I suppose it's something that, you know, has been talked about. It's starting to evolve as something, and you know, the recognition of Indigenous knowledge is growing, and I think hopefully I'll put some points forward today. It's mostly going to be about water. That's my go-to place, and yeah, so I'll kick off. I'm on Ngunnawal land here in Canberra. I acknowledge this land and thank them for allowing me to live on their country. And my mob is Kamilaroi, which is northwest New South Wales. You can sort of see the centre photo there. That's greyed out. It's a fairly large nation. We did go up into Queensland and have connections over the border. Our mob never saw that border back then, 45,000 years ago. So I do what I do for my generations that have gone before me, and also the generations to come. So obviously my kids' generation and the ones after them, but also the old people that have gone before me to honour their battles and challenges and adversities that they faced. They're a lot different to the ones we face today. Having a Zoom meeting rather than a face-to-face is nothing compared to what they had to endure. Australia, we know, only responds to a crisis. We've seen that in the last 6 months, 8 months, or last year and a half, and probably seen it over a number of times in the last 20 years. You know, we had the 1,000 kilometres of blue-green algal bloom in the Murray-Darling. Then we got the National Water Initiative. We had the mega drought, which followed the Millennium Drought. Is that normal? I don't think so, but I think it's, you know, there was talk about changes in water management that soon disappeared because we had other issues pop up. So we've got species extinctions happening and have been happening for the, you know, since colonisation. And yeah, we've got a review of the EPBC Act, and hopefully it'll go in the right direction, not in the wrong direction. We've had coral bleaching after coral bleaching, and I suppose, you know, there's people that question that, but you know, I think there's plenty of evidence out there. Millions of dead fish, I suppose that was the big one for me. You know, towards the end of 19, we saw millions of dead fish in the Lower Darling, and out of that come the native fish recovery strategy, and you know, that was an opportunity they threw a bit of money at it. I sat on the scientific committee for that, and there was a cultural committee for that. So hopefully there will be changes, but really when it comes down to it, the way we manage water is key to the problem. And then to top it off, we had the devastating fires of the summer here in Australia, and you know, out of that we had a number of panels, expert panels set up, and you know, that hopefully there'll be changes to the way we look at the landscape and how we use fire in the landscape. And then we had Vicky Jefferson was on Australian Story in May on ABC, and you know, he talked about his role in sharing Indigenous knowledge and fire. You know, one of his quotes that stuck, you know, was give Aboriginal people a go, because the last 200 years we haven't had a go, and if we get a go, we might make a difference. I hate that term, sorry. It's fresh in my mind that someone said that if we have a go, we get a go. This is day one in the colony, I put it. Any chance we can, it's a meme off Facebook. Any chance you can show us how to find water and food? So, you know, they ask questions at day one, but unfortunately those questions stopped. And obviously when we were not human for a number of years, for many years, you know, those questions stopped being asked. And I think that's time for change. And so the way I look at myself and what I do, you know, culture for me is who I am and my mob and family and kin, based on respect. I'm always listening, but I've been talking a lot actually during COVID, a lot of Zooming. But it's, you know, when you think about what you have, the tools you have in learning about your culture, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So you've got to do double the listening to the talking. So I'm always learning, passing on that knowledge where I can to my next generation, the kids obviously, and you know, language is a key part of who we are as well. So if we understand language is a key part of that, then I think there's an opportunity. You know, we have many languages. That's a challenge for the Australian context. But you know, for me, my mum never learned her language. My nan knew bits of it. She lived till 95. I only know the rude words, and you know that's the challenge we're under. And you know, I can go to ANU here in Canberra and pay to learn my own language. I'm probably not going to do that because it just doesn't feel right. And obviously, it's not Indigenous people teaching that. Connection to country is always crucial about who we are and where we're from, and that place, you know, those places have strong connection of especially in identity. And you know, for me, my cultural water, my gali is the Kamilaroi word for water, and obviously my cultural species are important as well. This is that's my background actually. So it's Booba Lagoon. Took this in early 2000s on an old film camera and scanned it in, and you know, it appears a lot in a lot of my presentations, and that was when it was healthy. It's not looking too good at the moment, but it was in a good place at that time. And you know, there's a strong cultural story and connection to that place for Kamilaroi people, and it's part of initiation for men. The dreaming story of the Garia is strong as well in our culture as well, as part of creating that lagoon. That's my other test site, is Guida Wetlands. That's the Gingham Waterhole. It's looking pretty healthy there. And you know, places like that, our wetlands dry and wet seasonally, but also when you add water, it comes back to life. And you know, birds return, birds know the water's there, and fish return. And you know, when you see places like this, and not everyone knows about these places, it's sort of something to celebrate. You know, we need to get the word out, and I think my challenge is to try and get Indigenous knowledge to influence the way we manage that wetland as well. So where are we at? Indigenous people are always the object of Western methodologies rather than the co-contributors or leading that research, you know. And you know, the Western way seem to miss the relationship of knowledge, culture and country and ways of knowing and being. You know, that's something I've sort of been realising. Like this isn't my space, but when I think about Indigenous methodologies, I think I just do it anyway. But it's really trying to put the buzzwords around it. And it's, you know, our knowledge is built around our country, our cultural identity, our language, and then obviously those complex social systems. And you know, those knowledge holders we hold in high esteem, and you know, they're the ones that, you know, I listen to a lot. Storytelling is central to Indigenous epistemologies. There's one of those buzzwords that I'm not used to. And you know, that's the way we communicate. You know, we tell stories, and that stories also, you know, they go in circles. They don't go in that straight line. You know, when you think about the way we connect, you know, the yarning circles, and also a lot of the concentric designs in our art, you know, that's the way Indigenous people tell our stories. But unfortunately, our storytelling has always been perceived as myth and legend, tall tales, folklore, fables, mumbo jumbo, whatever else people wanted to throw at it, you know, and that moves that traditional knowledge from the realm of a science into fiction. So it's make believe and made up, and that's the challenge that, you know, we're under these days, is try and make that knowledge center and bring it back for what it is, you know, and that knowledge of thousands of generations of observation, and let's call it science, of one's country is definitely not acknowledged in the way we do business. You know, traditional knowledge of water, I believe, is a science. I'm trying to, you know, build some credible evidence around that. And it's an ongoing understanding, you know, as I mentioned, that observations and, you know, this old knowledge of the driest inhabited continent on Earth is just not respected. And I think, you know, we'll have a look at that a bit more, but it's something that, you know, I'm trying to bring to the table, and hopefully people can acknowledge it and and champion it. So first scientists, this is just a way, that I believe our mob were scientists before science was a thing. The aim was to survive and access all available resources sustainably. The apparatus was knowledge of connected landscapes, country, fire, sky, species, and water. The methods was our observation, our stories, our language, song, dreaming, and law. The results is we're still here. Sustainable, adapt, and mitigate. We've even survived policy. And I suppose the conclusion is that that survival is built in, and obviously we can replicate a lot of these things as well. These are just some examples of scientific achievements. The bush foods and medicines that a lot of our mobs had, they were constantly testing to get the best out of their country. And, one is that the macrozamia in the sandstone country around Sydney, the burrowang or buttawang, it was high in a toxin, and it took a long time to obviously get rid of that toxin, but it took a process, and it could be replicated to be a key part of a staple food, high in starch and things like that. But it also, I think it was like an arsenic-based toxin. So yeah, it was pretty nasty. So refinding and finding water on the dry inhabited continent, I think is cool. And, understanding groundwater as well, where you don't have any surface water. When the rivers stop running, knowledge of the deep water holes, or we call them refugia these days, but to know where they were. Wetlands were the supermarkets and kidneys of the river country, and obviously finding species and refinding species on country, whether they're tasty or cultural. This is a map I found while I was doing my master's in groundwater, and what it is a spear thrower that an old man had engaged with or an anthropologist had been engaging with a man, the Pintubi mob, and at the end of their time together, the old man gave him the spear throw, and on the back was all these concentric circles. There's those circles again. And what it was a map of this old man's country in the desert of all his water holes. And, each had their own name, had their own laws of protection. But really, when you think about that, that's a GIS layer in modern day terms. But it was that the knowledge of that man had of desert country was around water and language. Fish traps, some of the oldest human engineered structures on the planet. The eel traps in Western Victoria now, they've got UN heritage listed. Sea level rise, the last ice age, coastal people having to adapt and move. Fire is a key part of the landscape. It's in the toolbox, that right fire for country. Navigation and hunting by the stars. Indigenous astronomy is going gangbusters at the moment, and it's a key part of some really cool stuff you can do and listen to in Science Week. And stories of volcanism. There was some recently validated. There was some Queensland experiences around 7,000 years old, and the Victorian one, the Gunditj Mara one, which I'll show in a sec. But the link, there's some papers there you can have a look on and have a click on. I can provide this presentation as well. But yeah, the Gunditj Mara one, is it the oldest story on the planet? There's a couple of stories that have popped up recently. One was putting it 34,000 years, but I think some of the dating around the volcanic activity puts it around 37. So, that's the people that pass down that knowledge keep talking about it. So it's a significant impact in their history and connection to their place. The Australian, that was the Queensland example of understanding eruption history and the stories of rivers of fire. So, that's really cool. And then Australian Geographer had a special edition and of Indigenous knowledge, but this one talked about as the sea level rose around 7,000 years ago in Port Phillip Bay, the Nunn and Reid paper. So, that is to a point validating Indigenous knowledge. I did my master's thesis on Aboriginal people and groundwater, and 15 years later, hopefully it'll be published by the Queensland Royal Society. They've got a spring special edition coming out soon. So that'll be exciting for me. It's old news, but it's good news. And as I talked about celebrating this knowledge, you look at that map from Robert Zook's. He digitized sort of continents and their surface water. And you can sort of see the Murray-Darling Basin in the southeast and the Lake Eyre Basin just to the northwest of it in the yellow. And the knowledge of those places potentially still exists, and we're just not accessing that knowledge the way we manage all value water. And I think it's time to, part of my role is to try and bring that to people's attention, and let's celebrate it. The other challenge is diversity. For researchers know that, that every mob is different. There's language differences. Each different colour on that map there of Aboriginal Australia, is a different language group, and, different landscapes, cultural practice, capacity, status and governance. So you think about the challenges of trying to engage, but Aboriginal people are nice people. You should have a yarn with them. I would definitely recommend that. He sits at my door. I painted him a number of years ago, Yabba the carpet snake. He's part of my grandfather's totem. A lot of the totemic system stopped, but it was linked to him. So he sits at the front door and hopefully protects our household. And, when I think about water, it's in our songs, it's in our dances, it's in our dreaming stories, and it's strong in the art as well, because being a dry continent, water is the key part of survival. So traditional knowledge for me is how our old people knew water, tell our stories and our science our way, how we find and refine water in a dry landscape, and we value and protect that water, and then obviously validate that knowledge for our mobs, to access into future generations. A bit of history of water, of this driest inhabited continent on Earth, with this one of the oldest surviving cultures on the planet that has no water voice. So our water voice is absent due to being impacted by decisions that exclude us. We're the only colonised country without a treaty with its First Peoples, and we're always an afterthought. We're out of scope and beyond, it's what you do beyond the welcome or your reconciliation action plan that I judge. And, when I'm tired of seeing big research programs that, I've been involved in over the years, we're just out of scope. And then when you raise the issue, it's going to cost too much, so it can't happen. And if we're not in the terms of reference up front, then we've got Buckleys that have been involved. So, that's going to be the challenge for NESP 2. NESP 1 has done its best to try and turn this around. NESP 2 could have a great opportunity to do it even better of what we've done here in NESP 1 and the Threat to Species Hub and the other hub. So, there's a great opportunity there to make a difference. Hearing what we don't have, the reviews that you see, the closing the gap statements, we know what we haven't got. You don't need to tell us again. And I think it's the challenge is what happens next. Those reviews just become a dust collector or take up memory in your hard drive. The other aspect is, non-Aboriginal people telling our stories. That's something that probably needs to stop. There's no disrespect there. You need to be a champion for our voice. And I'll sort of explain a bit later. If you give us that opportunity, you need to step back as well. A big example was the fish kills. There was 2 scientific expert panels and not one Indigenous person. You had traditional owners that know their country in the lower Darling, and they were not considered as experts on their own country. So that was a real challenge to accept. And, science, the culture of science needs to change as well. Wait, there's more. Having the resources not relevant or culturally appropriate. We're always walking in 2 or more worlds, and sometimes we don't fit. So that's a challenge for a lot of Indigenous academics or science students that have a career in mind, and I think that's something that we need to think about as well. We need to decolonise the curricula, let's say indigenize it. I know there's a few unis trying to do that now, which is great to see. And as I mentioned with the fish kills, we're not seen as experts, we're only storytellers of myth and legend around the campfire. We're always up the back of reports, policies, plans and legislation. You see it constantly, that we're always right up the back. People have stopped reading by then, so we don't really have that opportunity. There's no national strategy for water, let alone science. There's no centre of excellence. When you look at the Australian National Science Strategy of 2017, it says Indigenous people should consider STEM just like women. That's all we got to hang our hat on. So I suppose that we need to build that up, and obviously we also need to take a stand as well. And obviously governments, time after time, deleting our programs because it's a new leadership or it's a new government. They don't want the old government's programs, but they might be the best program ever, but too bad. I've been a victim of those. So it's a challenge for us to, what happens after we're deleted? How do we bounce back? So my methodology is trying to shift the research away from Kamilaroi people being the research rather than to becoming the researcher. And I suppose it's up to a lot of you guys to facilitate that. And, you know, once you provide that opportunity, step back and let them lead, because that's, you know, that's then up to us as well to take the space. And, you know, my knowledge, as I mentioned, I'm still learning about, you know, my culture and my country. And every time I go there, I'm about 900 Ks away from my country. But, you know, when I go there, I make the most of it. And I suppose it's how I relate to people as well. You know, Western thinking is gained and owned individually. Fill the void in water management, Kamilaroi water science. Be a voice for Kamilaroi. I can't speak nationally for Aboriginal people. I wouldn't dare. You know, I've been on a number of national committees, and I've always stated that I will seek my elders' permission, and then obviously that committee then needs to go broader. And there's a recent article I did in the Guardian, you know, the driest inhabited continent, and we should listen to some of the oldest water science on the planet. My cultural species, the Brolga, if they're turning up to my water places, that's a good sign. You know, they are migratory birds. They come from long distances. And if our wetland, our water places are healthy, the Brolgas are going to come, do their mating dance, and we can watch them and then mimic them as part of ceremony as well. But, you know, they're a key part of you know, they are a cultural keystone species for us, similar to, say, the wedge-tailed eagle. And I've said a number of times, I've probably said it way too much, that if I ever went into witness protection, I would be Aquila audax. I think that's a cool name. But yeah, don't tell anyone else. Hopefully I won't have to go into witness protection anyway. Some Indigenous Led Resources. I was lucky enough to do a Australasian Journal of Environmental Management, Indigenous Water Management special issue with Professor Sue Jackson. And, you know, there was Indigenous co-led and authors. There was case studies from around the country. And, you know, I think there was an abstract written in language from the Kimberley. So, you know, that was really cool for that. That was a first for that journal. And, you know, that's us filling the space. There's going to be a special edition, another one that I'll be co-editing with a Maori water researcher in the Australasian Journal of Water Resources. And then down the track, I've heard rumours of a river being a first author. That'll be interesting times. These are just some recent water quality resources that are out there now. Australian and New Zealand Water Quality Guidelines. This was a national committee I was on since 2009. And they finally got released in 2018. And there was some Indigenous principles from a New Zealand and an Australian point of view. I got the okay from my mob, and Roku Mihinui from Te Arawa in Rotorua, he got the sign off from his iwi and his elders. So to produce those principles, and then obviously they went out a bit broader. There was a lot of crossover between our values and the way we think about water between Australia and New Zealand, which was really cool. And then we built some guidance around cultural and spiritual values. So water quality managers or water managers then don't have they don't have excuse now. So this is my blueprint. Let's say my demands. These are just some, I don't know, fancy curly arrows. First People Science and Knowledge in the curricula. So indigenize that curricula. National First People Science Network. I'm currently working with Science Technology Australia, the Academy of Science, to try and build an Indigenous science network. There was a call that went out a little while ago, so members of Science Technology Australia would have got that call. I noticed a couple of societies I'm a member of never asked, and so that's disappointing, but other societies did. I'm a member of a heap of societies, but it's a call out to, you know, it's to build a network to give us somewhere to share, support, mentor, and give the next generation of Indigenous scientists hope that there is a career pathway for them out there. And obviously there's science and traditional knowledge being seen as something of equal value, rather than storytelling. And, you know, we don't have a centre of excellence for science for Indigenous people, and Indigenous research that is led by First Peoples is slowly on the move. So having cultural methods, that's what I've tried to base my PhD on the way and who I am and where I'm from, and to link it with the Western ways of thinking. We don't have a science strategy. We don't have a threatened species strategy from First Peoples' point of view. We don't have a climate change strategy. We don't have a national science strategy. So there's obviously opportunities there for us. And then, you know, down the track, we'll have First Peoples Science Fellowships, First Peoples Science Journal, First Peoples Science Conferences, and then World Domination. That'll do me.
Thanks so much, Brad, for that really thorough and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you. I'm sure we'll have some thoughts and questions. If people have a question or something they want to discuss, can you please put your hand up in the participants thingy-mabob, whatever you call it, or also feel free to type a question in and I can read it out.
I've got a question. This is John Pandolfi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. That was an excellent talk. I really enjoyed that. And I know you've given it from the perspective of water science, and I'm just wondering how your perception and your approach has permeated other scientific disciplines or other ecosystems around Australia. Do you think that the water issue in Australia is leading the Indigenous participation, or could you cite other examples and with other kinds of ecosystems?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, John. I wouldn't say water's leading. We're a long way from it. We are struggling to have a voice. You can just sort of see in the policy forums, in the expert panels, you see we're just not there. We're not at any of the tables. You know, I know the National Fire Response, and you know there are Indigenous people on those expert panels. You know, we have Stephen Van Leeuwen, and I think Oliver Costello's on one of them as well. You know, so that's in the response to the fire. So you know, they've in the fire space. Sorry, we're gonna have to use the pun. It's a hot topic because you know we're fresh off massive fires, and you know, there are examples of where cultural burns were used and saved some properties and things like that. So I think there's definitely some interest in that. I hope that, you know, that momentum doesn't stop. And I think that's something that, you know, we potentially need your assistance with is always, you know, if you're at a meeting, you're at a panel and they're talking about issues about country, and that would be potentially someone's country, you know, you could request, why is there no Indigenous people here at this table? You know, that's not that hard, you know, and I think that's something that you could easily request and be a champion of that. And I think there's, you know, astronomy is doing some cool stuff. So we have some Indigenous astrophysicists coming through, weather knowledge. There's a lot of stuff on the Bureau of Meteorology. So there's some really cool stuff there. Like I was involved in Melbourne Uni, got some funds from Prime Minister and Cabinet to build some curriculum around Indigenous knowledge. I helped coordinate the water aspects, and that curricula was for high school curricula and also primary school. So those resources are there for people to access, and there was also resources made for astronomy and fire. So those, water, astronomy, fire, were the three Indigenous knowledge aspects that curricula was. So teachers then now have an opportunity to build a lesson plan based around that. And I think that's a great opportunity as well. I think it's the more and more we put into this realm, I think the more and more people will start realizing that it's not storytelling, it's actually, there's obviously something valuable in that knowledge that can relate to one's country. Thanks.
Thank you.
Actually, I should have said, sorry, John. Sorry, Celia. There's through my role in the Threatened Species Recovery Hub under NESP, there's been some unbelievable examples of traditional knowledge working with Western science, and that space, the knowledge about one's country comes to the fore when you're thinking about species in that country, and whether they're threatened, common, or cultural, or sometimes they don't have a connection at all. But some of the traditional knowledge used in some of these projects and those outputs has been really cool to see, and I suppose that's something that should be celebrated as well.
Yeah, for sure. Selena, did you have a question or?
I did. Thanks, Brad. That was a wonderful talk. I wondered if you think that having increased recognition of Indigenous science may help towards reform in our environmental laws in Australia.
Yeah, that's hopefully happening right now with the review of the EPBC Act. I know the Indigenous Advisory Committee that is appointed by the Minister to give advice on EPBC matters. They put a submission in, and also some of those members are also a member of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, Indigenous Reference Group. They put a submission in, and I think that's things like that. If those submissions are acknowledged and change happens to policy and the way we do things, then obviously that builds our profile. And I think that's something that that it's going to take a courageous government to do that. And I think if they do, then obviously we'll be heading in the right direction. But at the moment, if states get a hold of that, I don't trust them at all. Sorry. Yeah. There might be some states that do it well, but some of the states that I've worked for, I wouldn't trust them. And I think to protect, and we just saw, the destruction of those caves in the Pilbara, that was just horrendous. It was so sad. There's more coming, and obviously there's on a daily basis development. The bulldozers are at our heritage every day, and I think it's usually too late when the bulldozer can't stop that we lose that heritage. We saw the dish get heritage protection, but not those ancient trees, birthing trees in Victoria. So there's an imbalance there, and I think there's a challenge for that as well, for policy makers and government people making decisions that they need to start thinking differently about the oldest living culture on the planet and celebrate it, protect it. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we've got some others with their hands up. Sean, did you want to go ahead? We can't hear you. You're still muted.
That's better. Can you hear me now? Yep. Thanks a lot for the talk, Brad. Really appreciated it. I've just got a quick question. I love the blueprint, obviously, and your first point on there, getting indigenising the curriculum, and I think that's a fantastic point and ambition. I just want your opinion on whether my wife is a high school teacher, so she tries to sort of nudge the curriculum where she can, but it's obviously there's a lot of hurdles in the way. What's your opinion? Do you think having a separate class or a separate set aside time for Indigenous knowledge to be integrated, that as an option versus say for maths classes you integrate Indigenous case studies and so you sort of weave it in that way. the contrast I'm trying to make there, whether you have a standalone subject, Indigenous knowledge, versus integrating it all into all the different subjects. What, in your mind, is the best way forward there? What's the path of least resistance and most effective way to indigenise?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, look, I appreciate your wife trying to do a bit. You know, that's great. But I think it's more about the national curricula itself. You know, it's and the way we teach and what we teach and how we think and how we connect, and you know, making Indigenous knowledge a key part of everything. And so that curricula that was built through Melbourne Uni was for every subject that those kids will learn. There was lesson plans and also resources for those teachers to actually build something around Indigenous knowledge, where it wasn't someone else's knowledge, which is always hard to do, but it was the way that you teach it and the way you promote it. And I think, you know, like my son's in year 11 this year, and he had to take Aboriginal studies as an elective.
Yeah.
That, you know, that's the challenge, is it? You know, but he also, everyone in year 11 has to take Australian studies. Yeah, right. Yeah, so we learn about Ned Kelly and Captain Cook, but we can't learn about the oldest culture on the planet. It's an elective, not core, you know what I mean? So it's bringing Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science, let's say, to the centre of the way we teach as well. And, you know, that's a challenge for the curriculum writers, but also, you know, all the way from my wife's in early childhood, and she does what she can. She's not Indigenous, but she does what she can to make sure that these kids understand Aboriginal ways and Aboriginal knowledge in everyday what she teaches those you know, preschoolers.
Roger,
Actually the same for primary, high school, and through university as well. Yeah. Thanks, mate.
Thanks both. I think Frederick had a question next.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Brad, for that very interesting talk. I was wondering if, when you propose to indigenize the curriculum, if that could make a difference in the fact that Australian governments have always been very good at turning on and off the tap of science whenever it's convenient to them. We've had initiatives funded and then being defunded, and part of your experience is part of that as well within New South Wales. Do you think that if we get a better sense of the Indigenous culture, it will help us to build a more solid and robust framework for dealing with our ecological crisis that we are facing now?
Thanks, Frederick. Good to see your face, mate. Yeah, look, I have no doubt that it'll change the way, because it's you know, like when you think about water and the way we manage water and value water, it's a commodity. It has a price on its head. It can be traded, and I think that's the challenge of a lot of our natural resources is the dollar value, and that's quite unfortunate, you know. But when you think about when, you know, say that cave that Rio Tinto accidentally blew up, accidentally blew up, you know, what's the price of that cave? You know, 40-odd thousand years old, occupation evidence, still a connection of those people to it. What's the price of that? You know, and I think if, you know, I know there has been a movement to try and value nature and put a price on, you know, trees and carbon and obviously heritage, but I think we need to look at the way we value these natural resources. And I think an exposure of Indigenous knowledge and the cultural value of these places is something that I hope will change the way we value these resources. And I think Indigenous knowledge can play a part in that for sure. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to Helen.
Thanks very much, Brad, and great to see you. Science faculty here is currently reworking on its Indigenous priorities, and you've covered a number of our aspects of interest today, but one I know our members are very keen to hear about is your advice, or anybody's advice, on attracting students into the sciences both. We love to have the students, and this is the pathway to the scientists, the joint experts of the future. So any advice you can offer us. I know we've got a number of members here today sitting eagerly waiting for advice.
Hey, thanks, Helen. Yeah, look, it's obviously, it's been a challenge for me for the last 20 odd years to realise, you know, I've nearly walked away from science a few times just through doors shutting or opportunities being cancelled, and you think, why the bloody hell am I doing this? You know, it's just, I give up, you know. But when I realised the opportunity I have to try and influence the way we think about Indigenous knowledge and how it can actually influence the way we, you know, if we build credible evidence around that, but also how we can validate some of that knowledge as you know, I don't really like that way. You know, we validate, Western science still has to validate our knowledge. And I think that's a change in culture, but also it's how it's making sure Indigenous voices are heard. And I think I mentioned earlier that, you know, if you're talking about Indigenous aspects or knowledge, and there's no Indigenous person in the room, then ask why. That's, you know, that's a start. But then, if you can't find anyone, like I'm still looking for an Indigenous science mentor. You know, that's been the last 20 years, and that's been really hard. There's plenty of non-Indigenous mentors out there that I've accessed and worked with, and got a lot off my chest with, and you know, been my sounding board and therapy, let's say. But you know, I think that challenge of we don't have Indigenous faces as part of science, and you know, that those fish kills were a key example. They wheeled out Uncle Badger Bates from Barkindji country after the report was released, you know, and instead of having him as an expert talking about his country, he was well and truly rolled out after all the reports were done and engagements were done. And I think that's those little things, you know, the culture of science needs to think about how and change the way they do that. And like, I'm only just one voice of, you know, I've tried to, I think the last three and a half years, this is probably my 90 odd presentation, whether that's face-to-face conference, international keynote, or, you know, I've done about 10 Zooms this, you know, just these first 6 months of this year, you know, and I keep turning up, and I just want to hope that I inspire that next generation to turn up as well. And, you know, I think the more we celebrate and the more we see Indigenous faces talking about caring for country, you know, celebrating the ranger programs that happen across the nation and what they're doing, the more that I think the next generation will see science as a pathway and an opportunity, you know. And, you know, I've sort of, whenever I talk to kids of a younger generation or at an age where they're thinking about their future, you know, I say, you know, I've listened to some of the oldest water stories on the planet. I think that's pretty cool. And I think if they can realise that opportunity and realise that science is achievable for them, you know, and like I've said a number of times in some of my talks that, you know, going from year 10 to year 11 in the late 80s, I was told not to do science and any hard maths because I'd never be good at it. And, you know, that did spur me on. And I thought, no, I'm going to crack at this. I love this. I love enjoying about, you know, learning about the earth, and I suppose, you know, that led me down that pathway. But I think it's, you know, we need a bit more of that, and then obviously our Indigenous science leaders telling that, and then obviously people like yourself promoting that, giving the opportunity. You know, your role, what you've done for the journal, you know, that's a first. You know, that was brilliant. You know, like, I think more and more scientific journals think about the way they promote Indigenous knowledge is another tool as well to help promote Indigenous knowledge. Yeah, thanks, Helen. Oh, I waffle on. I don't know if I made any sense there. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And I think we're looking forward to our first Maori abstract very shortly.
Ah, nice.
You and Sue for what you led there.
Excellent.
There's not a hand up now. We have a little bit more time. So if you're not exhausted yet, I might throw one in there. I just wanted to ask you, this is completely from my own perspective, but from working here over the last 10, personally, I feel like there's a really big gap in a lot of the applied environmental and conservation research, in that research priorities and the funding that go with them seem to get decided at this really high level. And I don't see a good reflection there of sort of a broad scale exploration of what Indigenous people and Indigenous communities have as priorities for research, as research that needs to be funded. I sort of see the decision on what we're going to do research on happens, and then we say, can we engage with communities? And sometimes there's a really nice overlap and sometimes there isn't. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, I guess, where things are at now, or sort of opportunities that might be coming up to have sort of good input from communities and from an Indigenous perspective at that sort of high level of decision making, of actually defining what research priorities there are and what research should be funded. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think over the years, research agendas and terms of reference and funding sources, are slowly changing. And I hope NESP 2 changes for the right direction. And, I think that the challenge for a lot of communities, that they definitely have an interest in Western science, helping them manage country. But I suppose the way we research and the way we think about it, you sort of touched on it a bit, is going to communities and identifying what are their questions they want answered, rather than going to them with a question. Exactly. Say, I've got a PhD, I need you to help me answer this question, I'm going to get a PhD, see you later. But I suppose it's thinking about the way we research, flipping that design and methodology and cultural aspect of research, changing it to the way we engage. Get them. If you're going to work with a mob, what are their research questions that they want answered? How can they help? How can traditional knowledge inform that? And I think future science programs need to make sure that's accommodated. I know all the Indigenous researchers and liaison officers through NESP 1, we got together, and that was a key part of it. If NESP 2 is going to happen, the mob needs to understand that they are part of this process. They've got to be seen as upfront and champions and leading research or co-leading research with Western ways, and then the outputs are equally shared as well. So there's co-authorship, co-presentation, and things like that. So it's changing the way we research as well. So, I think if something you take out of it today, you go have a cuppa, and I use the 3 T's example of time. It takes time, and in that time you build trust, and through all that you have lots of cups of tea. And I think that's a key part of engaging with the mob, is that, you've got to be sitting down on their turf, building that trust, building those relationships to get to a point where, you can say, that species, that important? Do you want to know more about that? Or what do you want to know about your country from a Western or data point of view? How can we help? And I think that's something that, every researcher should think about, rather than, having a question and then going to communities and say, can you help me answer it?
Yep, totally agree. Thank you. That's great. And I love your point about time as well, because I think sometimes part of the barrier to that is that the timelines for rolling out this funding or whatever it is are not such that you actually have the time to build that trust and to get that feedback on what local priorities are. So yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
I think we had a question from Mandy. This is sort of a very general one, but Mandy had asked, is there a way we can help to give our Indigenous people the voice they need on an everyday basis? So just a small question.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think it's more about being a champion. As I mentioned earlier, if you get that opportunity where you've got that privileged opportunity to sit in a room, round a table, talking about issues, or on a Zoom, and then that issue comes up, you've just got to be that brave one that says, where is the Indigenous person here? If we're talking about X, and it involves Indigenous people, where are they? Why aren't they at this table or on this Zoom? And I think that's that's something you can do. You can do that every day, because the amount of Zooms we're on these days, there's no escape. And you'll see faces and names, and you can be that brave one. You might feel a bit funny about it, but you might say, are there any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people on this? Because we're talking about, this species that might have cultural significance. And I think you've got to be that brave one to ask that. And if you're all every day, well, I do it every day. I think it's baby steps, but I think we've got to take some big steps very soon.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we're sort of getting to the end of time, and I think we're sort of getting to the end of Hands Up. You probably need a drink of water by now, Brad, but huge thanks on behalf of everyone here. I think we had about 80 people here for most of the time. So huge thanks for joining us. Huge thanks from CBCS for raising some of these issues and discussing them with us. And hopefully, as always, these are the beginnings of discussions, not the final word. So thank you very much. I'm sure lots of us will be in touch with you down the road on this or that.
Well, that's the thing. Whenever I talk, there's always an exponential increase of requests.